feel your eyes on me. You are near, chasing down my silver light. Have no fear.
Welcome to this special episode of War of the Rebellion, Stories of the Civil War. I am your host, Leon, and this is an interview episode for War of the Rebellion. Joining me today is director and executive producer Stephen Summers from Cantilever Films, who is releasing a 5-part documentary series titled War Movie that, quote, examines not only the history of war in American cinema, but how this medium has shaped our country's perspective on conflict, foreign policy, race, masculinity, and national identity, unquote. Mr. Summers, thank you so much for joining us. It is an absolute pleasure to have you on. Please tell us who you are, what you do, and maybe a little bit about yourself.
Well, thank you. Yeah, first, it's great to be here. It's good to talk about this stuff and to a wider audience. So I've been in the filmmaking world in one facet or another for 20 years now. I kind of originated as a painter from the art world, so I kind of come from it from that direction. And I kind of over the years got into what's called installation art, video installation art, which is stuff in museums and kind of conceptual, really high conceptual things. And then I kind of drifted into narrative filmmaking, excuse me, as I got into teaching it, as one has to make a living. So I ended up making narrative films, and then I kind of drifted into these kind of small form documentaries, personal documentaries. And I kind of like the form a little bit. I never thought I'd ever formally do a large scale documentary, but this kind of came across my radar, and you have to go where the wind blows you, and this just kind of took me in this direction. And so I decided, ended up making this behemoth. five hours of content. Yeah. So it kind of grew from there. My whole kind of career has been just kind of like going from one thing to another and kind of learning from that and carrying it into the next thing.
Wow, amazing. What a journey.
Thank you.
What was the catalyst for you wanting to make this documentary series in particular? What I have to know after watching it, like, what got you started?
Sure. Yeah, because it's kind of strange. Like, I never desired to make a war film or this documentary about war films on like, if you would have asked me like 10 years ago, I would have been like, I don't know. But most of my films, and I think a lot of artists will say this, is they come from very personal places. And this was a personal place for me because I used to, or I guess I still do on occasion, watch these films with my father. I grew up and they were on in some fashion on repeat, whether it be on cable or, maybe a VHS tape, what have you. But they became part of like the background for me, and they kind of influenced how I saw the world. What he said about them. He was not a veteran himself, but he always had comments to say about, what was happening on screen, of like, that's not real, war is hell. I was like, I don't know, Dad, you've never been there. How do you know? But which is a very interesting question to me, like that kind of whole reality versus, lived experience. So it kind of came from that. That was kind of the root of it. And my father always said this phrase, and he said it in one direction. He would say, it's just a movie, which means, you can fictionalize anything and put it on screen and whatever. Mm-hmm. And he's right. Like, it's all about fictionalizing reality. But on the other hand, it's not, I took that saying as meaning something else. Like, it's never just a movie. A movie carries on beyond what we see, right? It has weight of how it affects us, how we see the world. So, these things, these movies, these war films are like, I see them as artifacts, like send reverberations out into the world and kind of just affect us in different ways. So that really got to me, and I really wanted to explore that. I wanted to like dive deep into these films and the history of these films and see how do they get made? Why did they get made? And, how are they different today than they were 30 years ago or 70 years ago? So it was about like kind of really unpacking this very deep, what seems simplistic thing, and looking at all the nuances of it, or trying to look at all the nuances.
Yeah. Oh yeah. It's the more that I think about the size and scale of the project that you set out to do, what was the most difficult part about creating this series, and maybe what was your largest obstacle that you had to overcome?
I would say it was just what to leave in, what to leave out. I mean, really, during the day, I'm an editor by profession now, so I'm used to cutting stuff out, but it's tough when you're trying to tell this very, nuanced history of something, where, there's so many films, right? And there's so many voices, there's so many opinions, and there's so many perspectives. And so at some point you have to find the through line, you have to find the narrative through it all. And, you have to stick to that. But there's some things that just get left on the cutting room floor. And that's, it always breaks your heart. But, I know I'm going to hear back from people be like, why didn't you put this film in there? And it's just like, I can't talk about them all. I just can't. So it was really, difficult to find, how can I make this exceptional to what is out there already? I think that's also something that, you have to do is, a lot of these things I'm saying in the documentary, have been said by other people. That's, definitely true. But how do you kind of put them in a new light in reflection to today or something like of that nature? So there's a lot of decision making of like, how do we talk about this, or how do we talk about that? That was probably the biggest thing. I mean, time, and also time, just, watching the number of films and, the research. So it's just a lot of work, but it's very enjoyable, very rewarding.
Yeah, I think I have you can't, there it is. You can't skim a movie like you can a book. Can you tell me about your research process there, about how did you manage your time with all of this film to come through? Like when you have like, must be thousands of films.
I mean, there's a lot. And far more, there's ones I've never even heard of still. I mean, that's just the way it's going to be. My basic, strategy was I first read a lot. There's been a lot written about this stuff. A lot of scholarly work done over the years by a lot of professors and researchers. So that was the first thing I did. I kind of like looked at what other people had done, their perspective, how it's been attacked, from what angles and things like that. And then from that, I started to build kind of the path I wanted to go down, right? And say, okay, well, this film seems interesting, or that film seems good. And then I would just, kind of watch them. And but I would watch them, you couldn't watch them for enjoyment. I hate to say it like that. You looked at it as like I said, again, an artifact, like you were looking at this, thing from the past, and just, looking at all the nuances and how people said things, or like, how scenes played out and stuff like that. So I had to be kind of cold about it in some ways, of like just kind of attacking it like as, very, subjectively in that way. So, it was a lot of viewing, a lot of watching, and it was enjoyable, but you just kind of had to sit down and go through it. So, yeah.
That leads me into another question that I had for you. While watching the portion about the anti-German World War I films that they labeled the Hate the Hun films, it had me wondering, how did you deal with the psychological toll of having to watch all of these movies?
It's good to have palate cleansers, as they say in the food tasting world, right? Like you get done watching a couple of these and you go watch maybe a Friends episode or something like that, right? Something be like, or just go out to dinner with my wife or something, very, very separate. But I mean, for the most part, like I said, I I kind of turned off the emotional viewing experience a little bit. A lot of times, sometimes the earlier stuff is easier to do that, because of just the way it's made, and it doesn't ring the same as contemporary films do.
Yeah.
But I mean, I just try to look at it as like how will it work in the documentary, right? How will it work? And then, oftentimes I go back and rewatch it again, but from an enjoyment point of view. And so, and then I would get that viewer experience from it. So, it's kind of give and take on that nature.
Yeah. While you were making this series, what era of films did you find yourself enjoying more?
Well, I think they're all great in the fact that they all have their own flavor to them. And that was the part that I really liked, is that you saw this evolution of the films, but also American perception of war, of the the military's interaction with the war, the veteran experience, and it just is this beautiful narrative of coming out of World War One and kind of being anti-war, and then going into World War II and being everybody's like gung-ho, no pun intended. And then coming out of that into Korea and Vietnam, and it just goes so far the opposite direction. But I think personally for me it's that Vietnam era of the fact that during the war no films were made, no war films about Vietnam were made except for one or two. So compare that to World War II, where there were just so many films made. I mean, it's really a sea change. And I find that so interesting. And I also am a child of the 80s. So I grew up with Platoon and Full Metal Jacket and all these things. So, that's kind of like, hits me really hard. And, my dad and his buddies were veterans of that conflict. Well, not my father, but his buddies were for sure. So, that still there was a sting there still. And those films kind of address that sting. And I think that's really interesting to me. The films kind of being in some way a healing component. I can't speak to how well that worked for the veterans, but I know as a society, they helped us talk about it a little better and maybe, not look at it with such critical eyes.
Yeah. Oh, wow. In episode 1, Dr. Stacy Peebles comments that the earliest stories are about war. Are there any themes you found in your research that had a consistent thread that stood out to you?
I think the one thing, I mean, the warrior experience is this, like she said, it's technology's changed, locations have changed, nations have changed, but the experience of battle, at least from what I hear and read, has not. That that kind of the reality versus the fiction of it has not changed, and that's the one thing I think I found throughout all these films is like this idea of maybe a young person wanting to enlist, going into the military, and then being in a conflict, and then coming out with a totally different point of view from what they thought it would be. And I think a lot of films from all eras explore this. They explore this idea of like, there's no way to, either write about it or put it in a film that will tell people what this is truly like until you experience it. I'm sure you can, somebody who comes from that world can say that, you can never encapsulate that. So that kind of mixture of, of reality and fiction is something that I find really interesting. But it keeps on feeding itself in some way, right? The movies present a fiction and then inspires people to go out and join the military, which is great. But then, the reality of conflict is different. And then, somebody else will make a movie, try to explain their experience, hoping it will, ring true. And it just kind of continues. And it's kind of just a fascinating cycle that is never going to end, So, which is, the beauty of the art too, right? It's never going to capture 100%, the authenticity of this experience. As much as we think we're getting closer to it, we're not. It's never going to be that thing. So
yeah, and it's something to think about. You talk about how the American Civil War photography brought those grim realities of war to the American public. How did this introduction of media change public perception of war? Did it make them like it worse or more?
Well, I think photography, if you just talk about it, was really like, we look at the internet or maybe social media as this like change, like this big change of how the world is seen. And photography was the same thing, like not so much, it didn't have that immediate impact of the internet or something like that, but it kind of like just reverberated throughout society at every level. But as far as warfare, yeah, it really it made the battlefield kind of a weird spectacle, right? I don't think that was ever a thing before. There were paintings of warfare and, etchings and drawings and all that. But I mean, to see a photograph is a whole different level. So I think there was a repulsion and also a curiosity, much like why we have war films, right? This kind of like pull and push to, the horror of it all. So, I don't know historically how much they kind of upset people. I know they've been used to kind of influence, political change and stuff of that nature. But as far as like how the public perceived war, I mean, the Civil War was interesting too, because it was like on our home turf. So, photographs or not, it was even closer to home because of that. So it was kind of an extra layer on that already personal level. But yeah, they really just kind of gave the first, soldier perspective of what it looked like, or at least tried to look like. Now, remember back in the day, they couldn't photograph action. They couldn't photograph battles because of the exposure time. So if you look at all the Civil War images, they're all just dead soldiers usually, or people standing there, right? We never really see a battle in progress because it was just impossible to take that photograph. So, we don't even have the actual war yet. We have the aftermath of the war.
Oh, wow. And it's definitely something to think about, especially with the American Civil War being as bad as it was. I'm not sure I wanted to see any video or photo from it.
Yeah. I mean, it would be really, really brutal, I mean, even today, with the conflict in the Ukraine, of like, how those images are coming across the internet. It definitely affects people and how they think about it and how they, see it.
I know for me, definitely. So the film mentions that more than 500 American Civil War movies were made during the silent movie era. As a director, was there anything that stood out to you about the directors of the time period?
Oh, I think you have to look at these films as a little differently than way we look at films today. I mean, filmmaking was brand new. It was, straight, fresh off the boat, so to speak. And they made them kind of following the same kind of, structure of like theater, right? So the idea was they didn't make films specifically for a group of people. So like there were no films made for, like teenagers or adult males or the females, right? It was, films were made for like everybody. So, a lot of the early Civil War films, the silent Civil War films, have a very dramatic tinge to them. And I don't mean drama as like drama on the battlefield. There's a lot of home life, a lot of, the wife, and her family at home as the soldier goes off to war and worrying about him and what happens at home. So war becomes kind of a secondary thing in the film, or at least like it's not the primary thing we see. So in that way, directors were trying to appeal to the female audience members, right? And then they'd have the battle scenes for the male audience members. So they're, if you watch them today, you'd be like, well, it's like overly sappy and a little like, dramatic and I don't know, what's the word, sentimental. It's very sentimental kind of filmmaking, over the top, if you will. So a lot of them were like kind of looking at it from that perspective. How can I make a film that is not only interesting but like appeal to all the viewers that are going to come into the theater of the time. So in some ways not much different than today, as far as like, how can we make a film to win over various groups of people. So
okay. Oh, cool. Now I have to ask for my audience,
sure,
any Civil War films from the silent era that they should pick up and watch?
Yeah, I think, the first thing I'll say about that is, there's 500 made, but very few of them exist anymore because either they've deteriorated because of the chemical process, the nitrate process of the filmmaking back then. They've either dissolved or just, they've been destroyed in fires or lost to time in some way. So there's, I don't know a number off the top of my head of how many exist, but it's not that many. And only a handful of them have been like kind of restored, so there's only a few out there that are like kind of, viewable, I would say. As far as ones to watch, I would say the top of the list has to be, The Birth of a Nation. It's both a great and horrible film. Like it's just kind of like you have to watch it. It's a history lesson. It's of what we did wrong and and all that. And the battle scenes are quite fantastic, and so I mean that's definitely something everybody should watch. As far as like two other films that I kind of didn't talk about in the documentary, there's one called The Confederate Ironclad, which is kind of a little different. It has some of the romance stuff, but it also has the Monitor and Merrimack in it, which is kind of odd for like a Civil War silent film to have like kind of a Navy battle in it, what little Navy battle there was back then. So that one is kind of cool, is the fact that it kind of goes in a different direction, and instead of just having this farm with soldiers charging across from it, which is what most of them are, right? It's what we think of as the Civil War. So that one's a little different. The other one is kind of, again, a landmark in cinema, is Buster Keaton's The General. Now, it's a comedy, but it's also like considered his greatest film ever as far as, his kind of type of physical comedy. So, it is a comedy dealing with the Civil War, but it is a great silent film to watch, whether you're into the Civil War or not. So those are two to look at.
All right. I know I'm going to get to watching them as soon as my schedule calms down.
They're hard to find. That's the other thing too. I mean, if you go on places like archive.net, I think they have some, but like, there's very few DVD releases of this stuff because it's just, it doesn't have a huge audience out there, but there are a couple places you can find them. So you'll have to do some digging.
All right. I also wanted to let you know that I was 35 years old when I found out that the Nickelodeon TV channel isn't a funny name for children. So
me too. Don't feel bad.
It turns out it's named after a bit of film history. Would you care to explain for the rest of our listeners what a Nickelodeon was?
Yeah, sure. So a Nickelodeon was a early type of theater, and I use the term theater in a loose quotes there. Nickelodeon comes from the word nickel and Odeon, which nickel, 5-cent piece, is what people would pay to go into. And Odeon means like a covered theater, so some sort of covered theater. And they were usually just very quickly made, haphazardly places where there would be a storefront and somebody would put together this little miniature theater, right? I mean, we're talking 1905 was the first one, as far as I think we know, in the United States, in Pittsburgh, from where I hail. So I got to give cred there.
Yeah.
But what was interesting about Nickelodeon's was, compared to, again, our modern cinemas, is films just played continuously. They just kind of ran all day. and you just paid and could go in at any time and sit down and watch for as long as you wanted and walk out whenever you wanted. So it was kind of a like come and go kind of world of like seeing cinema in a way. They eventually figured out, if we just structure these or, make, if the feature came along as what it's called now, something that's formally like an hour and a half or so, or 2 hours, that, there was a beginning and end, again, more like a theatrical presentation. But at first it was very much a, like, it was kind of, they weren't seen in good light. They were kind of seen as like, an inferior art form, and seeing as bad influence on people. And also, if you look back at the history of that stuff, of course, pornography has a huge role in it,
Sure.
as it does in most, evolution of image of any type. Pornography, if you look into that, has a part of that, making things popular and bringing it to the light. So yeah, Nickelodeons were just kind of little, I would almost say, disposable theaters that kind of like just started the groundswell of what we know as modern cinema.
Oh wow, I just had to ask that question because it blew my mind. I went around telling everyone. I was like, oh, I can't believe this. So kind of as we progress a little bit more into the creation of cinema, as along with a lot of early inventions in this time period, they kind of get consumed by the First World War.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, you also have the birth of Hollywood. Was there anything that you found particularly interesting about this time period doing your research?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. First, you said the birth of Hollywood, and I think that's kind of important to note that Europe was kind of the lead charge on filmmaking up until the First World War. But as the war came into existence, Hollywood had a chance to actually move to the forefront of that. In fact, a lot of films before that were not even made in Hollywood. Hollywood was not around when the films first came about. They were made in multiple places around the United States. Like actually Chicago, where I'm from, was a big film producer for a long time. But eventually the industry kind of moved out there for, the weather and lots of other reasons. But the war allowed, Hollywood or the American film industry to really flourish. It gave them the crown, or allowed them to take the crown, if you will, of like how to do this art form and really like expand it and push it. So, a lot of the inventions that, D.W. Griffith came up with was probably because, Hollywood was on top and he was allowed to do these things. The other thing that we saw, and I kind of highlight this in the documentary, is the evolution of technology, both on the battlefield and in cinema. So, the camera and the gun are kind of very similar. And you see that in the war films too. You see the evolution of like how to shoot a battle scene, right? Like filmmakers are learning how to do stuff at this point.
That's right.
They're just, this is a brand new language. And so if they really have to discover stuff. But the big one, and, it's still rocking our cinemas today, is, air warfare. The birth of that was huge. It changed everything. Maybe not as much as till it did in WW2, but I mean, when that got on screen, like people went nuts, right? I mean, it's still like Top Gun Maverick came out and it was like so big still, and nothing has changed really on that, right? There's nothing better than seeing airplanes battle in the air. It's still cool. So
yeah, you're 100% right.
Yeah, I think it's funny how it's just still attractive, so that war specifically gave us those things that we still lean on today.
Oh my goodness. And I know that's absolutely true, because as soon as I saw Top Gun, I was like, yeah, fighter jets, I'm in.
Yeah. I mean, Top Gun was probably the pinnacle movie for me as a kid. Like I was just, it was everything. It was just so sexy, for lack of better words. And so, I know it's been seen in different light now for the sexiness, but like just the planes, the soundtracks, the way it was shot, the characters, all that, it was just perfect.
Oh yeah. In episode 2, you dedicate an entire section to the movie Sergeant York.
Mm-hmm.
Why did you want to cast an eye on that film in particular, especially when there are so many to choose from the World War II era?
Sergeant York, well, first, it was a huge film. I mean, just you got to look at it from that. It was the biggest, I think, moneymaker for Warner Brothers that year. So, I mean, financially, it was success. But it really is the changing of the tide for the country as far as how to see warfare on screen. Coming out of World War One, in the 20s and 30s, the anti-war film was huge, right? We have The Big Parade, we have All Quiet on the Western Front. These are giant films that condemn warfare. They show the horrors of war. They show the mistakes of the First World War, and just how could we do this to ourselves? They really beautifully dive into these questions of the soldier experience and what it can do to a human being. And then the war starts to get heavy in Europe around 1938, 39. And, Warner Brothers is like, well, we got to shift gears here because, it's leaning like America's going to go into it. So how do we get people excited? So they took this World War I hero and told his story that was basically a very kind of pro-war film in a lot of ways. I mean, there are, things it talks about as far as being against war, but it really was a rallying cry of like, get excited about this stuff because it's coming. So coming out of off the heels of the anti-war films of World War One, it was surprising to see a film such as Sergeant York get made and be such a huge success too. And the funny thing is, the real life Alvin York did not want to do this film. Like he's a pacifist. He was ashamed of what he did in the war. He was proud of how he served, but he didn't want it to be exploited and, used as propaganda. But it was eventually how he started to see the things in Europe developing with Hitler and in Germany that he was like, okay, I think we need to do this now. And so, that's what changed his mind. It actually got to get made. Warner Brothers tried for years to get him to release a story, and he'd refused to do it. So, it's kind of impressive that the man held on for so long, knowing the power of the medium that it could become, like his story. So he was fully aware of what movies could do.
Wow. That's a really cool story.
Yeah, he's a fascinating man in many ways,
So, and when I was watching some of the footage kind of from the World War One era through Sergeant York, it made me think of the current conflict in Ukraine. And I wanted to ask you, do you think that war films will change now that we get footage directly from the combatants on the battlefield?
Yes. I can't tell you how. I'm not, I don't know how. But the one thing I also discovered throughout the documentary is that as our perspectives change of how we see warfare, whether it be through photography of the Civil War, the moving image in the early First World War, to, World War II, we actually had, cinematographers for news agencies on the ground, and the newsreels that came into the theaters. That all affects how we narratively tell the war story, right? And it will continue to change, right? If you look at how, coming out of the early Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts, how with, the helmet cam and the iPhone or the phone camera, how that has weaved its way into the narrative structure of storytelling. So yeah, in some way it will. I can't tell you how, because
Yeah.
that's up to directors and filmmakers to, figure out how to bring that into the narrative world. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of the beauty of it too, is it's constantly changing and reinventing itself, right? How we see everything is just constantly morphing, and the films reflect this and try to keep up and try to use this new language that we developed in our world. I mean, if you made a film today like just like the way they shot stuff in the First World War, people would think it's pretty much boring. So we kind of have to constantly do things in the new light of the current time. So
Oh, wow. Well, that'll be very interesting. I'm sure once this war is over, we'll also find directors' hands all over these videos that are being produced. I'm sure.
yeah, I mean, that also offers, it offers a chance for people to see something that's grim that might not have been available in the past as much, right? I mean, in Vietnam, you had a lot of news people on the ground, but you didn't. I mean, the footage you saw was always kind of censored through the news outlets or what have you. So this is, a lot more raw.
And one of the great themes that ran through your work that I noticed was how directors make a war film. And I wanted to ask you, as a director, when did you notice that you were watching a peer work? Like, when did a modern director kind of come about while you were watching this? Was it in the 1920s? Did it happen in the 40s? When did you notice that you were watching a modern director's work?
That's a tough question. I think you can always identify with a director if they're given the freedom to make the film they want to make. And that's not always true, right? They may be under studio constraints, and so, they may not be making the film that they see as the way it should be told. As far as modern, I mean, to me, the movie that just, but I've seen it before, was Apocalypse Now. To me, that is just a breaking of the mold of what a war film could be, as far as like from a creative standpoint. Now, it may not be the most accurate film, but
Yeah.
it expresses so much that, maybe was never done before. And that's probably the first film that I was like, oh, I would like to do that. I mean, I go back and look at like the Red Badge of Courage, and that film is incredible. Now I see just like, John Huston trying to express PTSD in the Civil War light. And he's trying to say, he wants to communicate something with people. And that really, affects me as a director. Like, and the fact that it got edited down and, was not as great of a movie as it could have been. But I think, Apocalypse Now for me was a sea change as far as like opening the doors of just the magnitude of what a war film could be. Yeah, that's probably the best, and also I think another one that I see as important to me is Black Hawk Down. That's another one that I can watch over and over and over again. And just from a director point of view, is just incredible. I mean, just how did they make that film? It's just chaos, and it just is so beautiful on screen, if you will, right? It just comes together. And that's amazing, right? That kind of like symphony of chaos, but yet it goes down so easily. So
Oh, well, thank you for the excellent point of view. And speaking of directors, you bring up a couple of times war films written by veterans after the war is over. If you were a cinephile and you wanted to understand war from a veteran director's point of view, which movie should you pick up?
Going back, I mentioned Wings. I think that William Wellman's Wings is just unbelievable. It's just, the guy was a crazy director who flew in the First World War and was like I'm going to do it the way I saw it. And, just it kind of just amazing, man. And the film's amazing. And, I make the joke, or I just laugh about the fact that they were talking about the new Tom Cruise Maverick Top Gun movie, like, oh, we put cameras in the airplanes. This is the first time we've done this. And I was like, it was done 100 years ago, like,
oh, no.
yeah. And I was just like, are you kidding me? Like, you're not, they did this with like planes made out of canvas and wood. Like, don't act like you're like writing something. So, but if you watch that movie and the fact that those planes are made out of canvas and wood, it's incredible, right? So, and it does have that real, veteran feel to it as far as like the joy or the beauty of flight. Of course, Platoon and Hamburger Hill are two great ones. The director Sam Fuller was a veteran of the Second World War, and he did a number of films that kind of really resonate, and I know among other veterans. The first one's The Steel Helmet, which is about Korea. That's interesting to see for a lot of reasons, but it kind of has a lot of grit to it. I'll say it like that. It has a very like small, it was made on a small budget in Los Angeles, but it has a very true, honest feel to it, a very just real psychological feel to it, especially of a film of that time. But he would go back later and make The Big Red One, which they've actually recut, a number of years ago. That is a pretty incredible film too. So I think those group of films are really great. And also, like I said, The Red Badge of Courage, although John Huston he didn't serve in the war as a vet, he didn't fight. He was over there. During the Second World War, he filmed battle, so he was exposed to it. So, I don't know if that counts as a veteran, but he brought that experience back with him of how that war affected men and PTSD, and he put that into Red Badge of Courage. So I think that is another movie that really should be looked at as far better than it really has gotten credit for.
All right, that's good to have in our back pocket for some future watchings. I have to know, when did you know that this project that you were thinking about was going to get off the ground? When you sat down and realized, okay, this is happening, and now I have a mountain of work to get through.
Well, it started out in a totally kind of different direction. I think I started it with the idea of it being a feature, meaning, an hour and a half, 2 hours. The idea was it was going to be kind of more conceptual, looking at how we view war in media, whether it be film, literature, video games, things like that. And it was about the everyday, non-veteran viewpoint of this stuff. Like, so from my father's point of view, I kind of started from that, right? How do we see warfare from these outlets? But it just kind of, at some point, I got into the research, and it just kind of spiraled in. I was like, oh, okay, maybe I shouldn't make it so conceptual. Maybe I should make it more grounded. And I thought that might be interesting because there really wasn't anything out there like this. So I was like, well, it's an opportunity. But then it quickly went from, an hour and a half to like 3 hours, and 4 hours. And then, and I had to add another fifth hour onto it just because there was just so much to cover. So at some point you realize, like, I got to go forward with this thing. I either jump off the ship now, or I ride it all the way home. So, I can't tell you what point I decided like to keep going, but usually when I start a project, I finish it. So, and what was nice about it is I didn't really have a deadline, so I could take as long as I wanted, or, as long as I needed to get the story across.
So how long was this series in production for?
I would say 3 years, I think,
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, it was me and a very small crew. We went around doing the interviews, and, COVID hit, which was, actually the first we were supposed to go to some big convention somewhere where there was going to be a bunch of scholars, and I had like numerous interviews set up, and then COVID hit and they canceled it. It's like, okay. And so you just put it on the back burner like the rest of the world did. So yeah, that was kind of part of it. But it's also, especially when you're working by yourself or with a very small crew, things just take time. And, sometimes times it hurts, but it's also your best ally of like letting yourself rest on something and going back and looking at it, going, well, maybe we should do it this way, So time can be a good thing too.
So I wanted to ask if you have any recommendations for the audience, any standout films that you believe should be required watching, or just maybe a film that you ended up liking more than the rest.
As far as films that stand out, I think, one of the newer ones that I didn't talk about, I show a very small clip, is The Outpost. It takes place in Afghanistan. And I think that's a very, very good film as far as just very simple. These guys are in this situation. There's a battle, and, it's not glorified. It's, not boosted up in any way. I think it's a very honest portrayal of, what that kind of combat looked like. I was surprised. I will say this, one thing you do find when you do this type of research is maybe you see films in a new light you didn't see before. And I think one film for me was American Sniper. I liked that film. I thought it was fine. But I think talking to a lot of scholars, re-looking at it really kind of made me see it as a much more, gray film than it really is, because it was very much seen as a very like, Chris Kyle's this amazing man, which he was, but it's very like, pro-war, pro-American, go, go, go. But it's not. It's very, PTSD is there, and like, the effect of this conflict on this guy is there. Another film I would say that is interesting is, well, there's two films that kind of, I think, haven't been seen very much. One is The Messenger. It's about two soldiers who have to deliver the news to family members about, deceased soldiers in war. Mm-hmm. Woody Harrelson's in it. It's incredible. But also there's a HBO film called Taking Chance, with Kevin Bacon, and it's about a guy who has to deliver the remains of a soldier from, coming back from Iraq or Afghanistan, and to his family. So, he has to kind of follow it, through the airport and stuff. But, he never got a battle to be in himself. And so he's kind of dealing with like, this kind of, I wish I had my chance. It's a very good film. It's very, very interesting. I think that should be seen.
All right. The last couple of questions I have for you. I have to know, do we get a glimpse of what the future holds? You had mentioned that you were working on another project. Is it top secret, or can we get a hint or two?
Yeah, it's not top secret. Nothing's top secret. You gotta put it out there, man. No, I'm working on it's a documentary, but it's a more of an experimental documentary. I'll say it like that. Again, it comes from a very personal place, but it's about the apocalypse and kind of the history of the apocalypse, how we've seen or have seen the possibility of the end of the world throughout history. Again, the narrative that has continued, much like war movies. It's like a thing that constantly comes up in every generation, and how we deal with this fear. And, are we living in different times now, or is it just the same as it was, 500 years ago, and we just think it is? So,
oh wow,
yeah,
you've piqued my interest, sir.
yeah. I like to deal in light topics,
Yeah. Oh, gosh. So when is War Films coming out, and where can the listeners take a gander at it? When will they be able to take a look at this?
It should be out streaming someplace within a month or so. So like end of November, early December, we should have it up probably on Amazon and other places. We're still hammering that out. But you can buy the DVD and Blu-ray at our website at cantileverfilms.com. So you can check it out there. But yeah, well, it'll be out soon.
All right, excellent. I will leave you with the last word. Is there anything that you would like to tell the audience?
Not really.
All
Sorry.
right. Oh, no worries. We've got it all. We've got it all then. Well, Stephen, thank you so much for joining me for this interview in this early morning. I greatly appreciate it.
Oh,
And
thank you.
we will definitely be staying in touch for any other projects that you want my audience to know about. I'm here for it.
Sounds great. Thank you. And if people do want to find out more about Cantilever Films and our future projects, they can go to cantileverfilms.com.
All right. I'll make sure there's a link in the description for everybody. And folks, thank you for dropping by on this special episode of War of the Rebellion, Stories of the Civil War. I hope you enjoyed it. And Stephen, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
All right, folks. Have a great one. Bye-bye. All righty. And before we close off for the end of the day, folks, I just want to let you know this interview had been done a while ago. And War Movies, The American Battle in Cinema, which is the 5-episode documentary that we're talking about here, is now released. You can watch it. I am telling you, go see it. Go watch it. It is worth it. It's right on Amazon. You are going to have a link in the description below. And I do have to note that I did get to watch it at no cost, but that does not affect my review in any shape, form, or fashion. I'm telling you, this is one of the best documentaries I had seen in a long time. It is so good. If you like film history, military history, you're a veteran, you're bored, it doesn't matter. Everyone should see this. It is that good. In fact, here at my family home, we are having a family watch party. We're watching the first 2 episodes together, and then everyone else is going to head on home and watch the rest separately. So if you've got the chance, go get it. Go see it now. Click on some links. In the description below, I'm going to have the Cantilever website as well as the Amazon link for $14.99, which you can't complain with. That's an excellent 5 hours of content. That's less than 1 movie ticket to see 2 movies. And, of course, a ton of better work has been put into these films than any film you're going to see in the box office today. So, folks, get out there, watch it, take a look. It's good. And I will see you in the next episode. Have a great one. Bye-bye.
Close your eyes and hear